There is a moment, and royal watchers know it well, when a woman walks into a room and the room forgets what it was doing. Not because she demanded it. Not because she announced herself. But because she simply arrived, and everything else became background noise. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had that moment on a Tuesday. And the world felt it on a Wednesday. And, by Thursday, nobody was talking about anything else. This is that story. It started, as so many things do in the world of royalty, with a color. Yellow. A shade so deliberately, so perfectly chosen that it stopped conversations mid-sentence across every fashion desk in London. Not the timid yellow of a woman playing it safe. Not the washed-out pale lemon that disappears under overcast British skies. This was a yellow that meant something. Warm, saturated, confident, the kind of yellow that painters argue about and florists charge extra for. The kind of yellow that, once you've seen it on the right person at the right moment, you cannot imagine it living anywhere else. Catherine stepped out in it, and it was as though the color had been waiting its whole life for her. She had worn yellow before, of course. The Princess of Wales had never been a woman who shied away from color. Her wardrobe over the years had told its own quiet story of growth, from the careful, restrained palettes of a young woman learning the rules of royal life, to the bolder, more assured choices of a woman who had long since stopped needing anyone's approval. But this yellow was different. This yellow was a statement. Not the kind that gets made with words or press releases or carefully worded announcements through official channels. The kind that gets made with a hemline and a silhouette and the way a woman carries her shoulders when she knows exactly who she is. The outfit itself was a masterclass in how to be noticeable without trying. The cut was elegant, structured at the shoulders, flowing at the hem, the kind of tailoring that whispers rather than shouts. The fabric caught the light in a way that felt almost cinematic, as though someone had specifically arranged the sun for the occasion. Catherine wore it with her hair swept back just enough to show off the earrings, simple and glinting, chosen with the same precision that governed everything about her public appearance these days. Every detail considered. Nothing accidental. And yet the whole effect felt completely effortless, which is, of course, the hardest thing in the world to actually pull off. She smiled at the crowd gathered outside, and the crowd smiled back in that helpless, involuntary way that people do when someone genuinely delights them. Photographers, who spend their working lives trying to stay professionally detached, found themselves leaning forward. It had been a year of watching Catherine carefully. The world had done that, watched her carefully, with a particular mix of concern and admiration and the deeply human hope that someone they'd grown fond of would be all right. She had been through something enormous and private, and she had handled it with a grace that had genuinely moved people who hadn't expected to be moved. She had stepped back when she needed to, which took its own kind of courage. She had returned when she was ready, which took even more. And she had returned not diminished, not tentative, not performing recovery for public consumption, but fully, visibly, unmistakably herself. Perhaps more herself than she had ever appeared before. That was the thing about Catherine in the yellow dress. It wasn't just a fashion moment, though it would absolutely be treated as one by every magazine that published photographs of it. It was a declaration of presence. A full-bodied, color-saturated announcement that said, "I am here. I am well. And I am not going anywhere." The venue that morning was one of those beautifully British institutions that looks modest from the outside and reveals itself slowly, a community space that did important, unglamorous work with children from difficult backgrounds. The kind of place that relies on attention and funding and the occasional royal visit to remind the people who control budgets that the work being done here matters. Catherine had championed causes like this for years, long before it became fashionable to talk about early childhood development as a political priority. She had built her royal identity around it with the patient, methodical dedication of someone who genuinely believed in what they were doing, not someone fulfilling a brief. She crouched down to talk to a small boy who was showing her a drawing he'd made. He was 4, maybe 5, with paint still visible on his left hand from an earlier activity, and he was explaining the drawing with the absolute authority of a child who has never once doubted the quality of his own work. Catherine listened with her full face, not the polite half-attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but real, warm, genuine listening. She asked him a question. He answered it at length. She laughed at something he said, and it was real laughter, the kind that catches you a little off guard. The yellow dress pulled slightly on the floor around her as she crouched, and not a single person in that room was thinking about Sussex. That would come later. It always came later, these days, the comparison, the contrast, the inevitable side-by-side that the internet would assemble within hours of any royal appearance by either camp. And, in fairness, it wasn't entirely without basis. There was a parallel story unfolding across the Atlantic, a trip of a certain kind being made by a certain couple, and the world had opinions about it. Strong ones. The kind that get typed in capital letters in comment sections and turned into opinion pieces by journalists who know exactly which takes generate the most traffic. But, in that room, with the yellow dress and the small boy and the drawing and the real laughter, none of that existed. Only this. Catherine had a quality that was difficult to articulate but impossible to miss once you noticed it, and that quality was settledness. She was settled in herself. Settled in her role. Settled in the knowledge of what she was doing and why she was doing it and who she was doing it for. It hadn't always been this visible. In her earlier years in the royal family, there had been a watchfulness to her, a carefulness that occasionally read as stiffness, the body language of someone who knows they're being scrutinized and hasn't yet learned to ignore it. That was gone now. Replaced by something warmer, more open, more certain. She moved through the space the way water moves, finding the shape of each room, each conversation, each small person who grabbed at her hand or thrust a painting toward her face. She didn't manage it. She inhabited it. By midday, the photographs were everywhere. Every major newspaper in Britain had them above the fold. Every fashion publication had already drafted 3 different articles, one about the dress itself, one about the designer, one about what the color yellow meant, as though colors have meanings the way words do, though, to be fair, in this case it really did seem like it might. Social media, which had the attention span of a hummingbird with a caffeine problem, stopped its endless churn and focused. The posts multiplied. The reposts multiplied faster. Within hours, there was a corner of the internet that had effectively become a yellow dress appreciation society, and it was, honestly, a lovely corner to spend time in. Fashion editors who had spent years cataloging Catherine's style evolution were reaching for superlatives they'd been saving. Women who had never once thought about the symbolism of color in public dressing found themselves thinking about it now. And, in the background, barely audible beneath the noise of all that yellow, the other story began to take shape. Because while Catherine was crouching on the floor of a community center in Britain, laughing at a small boy's drawing, another royal narrative was being constructed on the other side of the world. A trip. A tour of sorts, carefully arranged, strategically timed, packed with the kind of symbolism that requires a press team and a vision board to assemble. Meetings with important sounding people. Photographs in significant locations. Statements about significant things. The full architecture of influence, built and displayed with obvious intention. And the world looked at both things at once, the way it always does now, in the age of the split screen and the hot take and the comment that gets 10,000 likes before breakfast. The contrast was not subtle. On one side, a woman in yellow, on her knees on a community center floor, listening to a 4-year-old explain a drawing of what appeared to be either a dragon or a very ambitious dog. On the other, a couple managing their image from a distance, framing themselves as relevant to conversations they had, at various points, opted out of. People noticed. They always notice. The question that began circulating quietly at first, then loudly, then very loudly indeed, was a simple one, and it was this: what is the difference between royalty and the performance of royalty? Catherine, in the yellow dress, on the floor, with the boy and the drawing, was one kind of answer. The Sussex trip was another. And the world, with its extraordinary capacity for forming strong opinions about people it has never met, was already deciding which answer it preferred. Back at the community center, Catherine stood up from her conversation with the small boy. He had given her the drawing as a gift, which she accepted with the kind of delight that made it clear she intended to keep it. She carried it with her through the rest of the visit, tucking it carefully under her arm, making sure it didn't crease. The yellow dress moved with her through the afternoon. Outside, the crowd had grown. They were holding their phones up, most of them, the way crowds do now, capturing the moment while they're still in it, as though the memory alone isn't enough. as though they need the proof that they were there. But some of them had put their phones down. Were just watching. Just present. That was the thing Catherine had always been able to do, even when she was still finding her footing in the most scrutinized family on the planet. She made people want to put their phones down. She made people want to just be in the room. The yellow dress caught the afternoon light as she turned to wave, and, somewhere, in a photographer's lens, it bloomed like a held breath finally released. And that was only the beginning. Because the Sussex trip hadn't finished yet. And Catherine's week hadn't finished yet. And the world, with its appetite for comparison and its complicated feelings about what royalty should look like and who gets to claim it, that hadn't finished yet either. The real story, the one underneath the color and the cameras and the carefully managed optics on both sides of the Atlantic, was still unfolding. It would take another day to become fully visible. But it was already there, gathering. Yellow and waiting. The photographs from Tuesday were still trending on Thursday when the Sussex story landed properly. That timing was not an accident. Nothing in the world of modern royalty is an accident, especially the timing. There are people whose entire professional purpose is to think about when a story drops, what it lands next to, and how the juxtaposition will read. There are spreadsheets involved. There are strategy sessions. There is a kind of chess being played at all times, quiet and relentless, and the pieces are press releases and travel itineraries and carefully chosen locations that telegraph a certain kind of seriousness to anyone paying attention. Prince Harry and Meghan had been photographed in a country that was not Britain, meeting with people who were not family, on a trip that was not official in any royal sense but was being photographed and documented and released with the kind of professional precision that suggested it was meant to be received as something significant. The framing was deliberate. Every image told a story about relevance, about two people who wanted the world to understand that they mattered, that their absence from the firm had not diminished them, that they were doing important work in important rooms and that history would remember them for it. This is not, in itself, an unreasonable thing to want. The problem, and it was the problem that no amount of strategic timing or carefully curated photography could quite solve, was Catherine. Not Catherine as a rival. Not Catherine as someone playing the same game on the opposite team, which is how certain corners of the internet preferred to frame it, because conflict is more interesting than complexity and rivalry generates more clicks than nuance. But Catherine is a simple, obvious, undeniable fact. A woman who had spent 15 years quietly, methodically, sometimes painfully building something real inside an institution that resists change, and who was now, at what happened to be this precise moment in history, visibly, radiantly inhabiting the thing she'd built. You cannot manufacture that. You can manufacture a lot of things. You can manufacture access and opportunity and the appearance of influence. You can manufacture the meeting with the important person and the photograph in the significant location. You can manufacture the press release and the narrative and the strategic positioning that places you adjacent to causes that resonate with people who matter. All of that is available if you have the resources and the team and the willingness to do the work. But you cannot manufacture settledness. You cannot manufacture the quality of someone who is exactly where they're supposed to be, doing exactly what they were built to do, not performing it for anyone but simply living it in front of witnesses. That was Catherine in the yellow dress. And that was the thing the Sussex trip, for all its careful construction, could not touch. The commentary started, as it always does, in the British tabloids, which have the moral complexity of a food fight and the reach of a broadcast network and have therefore shaped public opinion about the royal family for longer than most people alive today have been following the story. The headlines were not subtle. They were also, for once, not entirely wrong. There was a comparison being made, and the comparison was fair. And even people who had spent years defending Harry and Meghan from what they considered to be unfair press coverage found themselves going quiet in a particular way that meant they were doing the math and not loving the result. The math was simple. It was brutal in its simplicity. On one side, a woman embedded in the actual work of an institution, present, consistent, unglamorous in the truest sense of the word, doing the quiet labor of showing up to the community center and the school and the charity event not because it generated good press but because she'd built her public identity around the belief that early childhood matters and that presence is a form of leadership. On the other side, a couple whose relationship with that institution had become defined primarily by their departure from it, now attempting to demonstrate their relevance to the world through a trip that read, to many observers, as image management dressed as purpose. It wasn't that the work Harry and Meghan were doing was meaningless. That was the wrong argument, and the people making it were, in most cases, not making it in good faith. There are genuine causes attached to their foundation. There is real advocacy happening. But advocacy performed primarily for cameras, in locations chosen for their symbolic resonance, at moments timed to generate maximum coverage, that is a different thing from the work itself. And people who have finely tuned sensors for the difference between genuine commitment and the performance of genuine commitment were beginning to separate those two things in their assessment of what they were watching. Meanwhile, Catherine had shown up for the third time that week. A different venue. A different cause. The same quality of presence. This time it was a school, one of the schools connected to her early years initiative, a program she had championed and developed and pushed through the resistant machinery of institutional change for years. The children here knew her, which was itself a kind of miracle when you thought about it, because royals are not generally known to children as people. They're known as images, as concepts, as the faces on stamps and coins and the backs of envelopes. But these children knew Catherine the way children know a regular adult in their lives, with the casual familiarity of someone who has actually shown up enough times to become normal. One small girl ran toward her across the hall in a way that suggested the royal protocol briefing had made absolutely no impression whatsoever. Catherine caught her. She didn't flinch. Didn't do the small sidestep that people with security teams learn to perform when unexpected physical contact is incoming. She just caught the child, laughed, and got on with it. The cameras got it all. That afternoon, the photographs sat next to the Sussex photographs in every publication that covered both stories, and the editors didn't need to write a word of analysis. The images did all the work. There was Catherine, on the floor again, eye level with a 5-year-old, the kind of body language that says your world is as important as mine right now, and there were Harry and Meghan, photographed in a series of locations that looked like the visual vocabulary of a TED Talk, thoughtful expressions, important people, the geometry of people who are taking themselves very seriously. Neither set of photographs was dishonest, exactly. Both were showing something real. But one was showing something that had been built slowly, over years, out of actual material, the sweat equity of genuine investment in a cause. And the other was showing something that had been assembled recently, out of the anxiety of people who understand that the world moves fast and that relevance has a shelf life and that you have to keep generating proof of your own importance or the world will simply stop asking. The public is not stupid. This is the thing that gets forgotten, sometimes, in the calculations of image management. The public is not stupid. They are often distracted. They are often overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information competing for their attention. They sometimes make decisions based on incomplete information, or based on the emotional logic of tribal loyalty, which is a very powerful force. But they are not stupid. And, over time, over years, over the accumulated weight of many small moments watched and remembered, they develop an instinct about what is real and what is performed. That instinct is not always articulable. But it is almost always right. And the instinct, running through the comments sections and the group chats and the editorial meetings that week, was pointing in one direction. The Sussex trip had a particular quality that people were struggling to name. It had all the right elements: the important cause, the international location, the serious meetings, the aspirational language about change and legacy and global impact. It was, in every technical sense, well produced. But there was a hollowness to it that no amount of production could fill. A sense of people constructing their own importance in a vacuum, without the grounding that comes from actually being embedded in something larger than yourself. Without the friction of an institution that pushes back. Without the accountability of a role that requires you to show up even when the cameras aren't there. Harry had walked away from that friction and that accountability, and he had his reasons, and some of those reasons were legitimate, and the story of his departure from the royal family is genuinely complicated in ways that simple headlines cannot capture. But the cost of that departure was becoming clearer every week. Not the cost in terms of titles or access or the mechanics of royal life. The cost in terms of purpose. The specific gravity of knowing exactly what you're for, of having a role that was built for you over centuries, that carries the weight of history and expectation, that gives your presence in a room a meaning beyond your own personality. Catherine had that gravity. Harry had traded his away, and, whatever he'd received in exchange, freedom, authenticity, control of his own narrative, it was not, apparently, the same thing. You could see it in the photographs. Catherine in yellow, in a school hall, catching a running child. Harry and Meghan in a curated space, in a curated country, managing a curated image. Both real. Both chosen. Both telling the truth about what each of them had become. And the world, watching both stories simultaneously, was making a judgment. Not a judgment about character, not a judgment about who was a good person or a bad person, because those were questions that required more information than photographs could provide. But a judgment about something simpler and more immediate, about who was present and who was positioning. About who had built something that could stand on its own and who was still in the process of construction, still trying to convince the audience that the building was already finished. The Sussex trip continued. More photographs. More meetings. More carefully worded statements about purpose and impact and the work they were committed to doing. Catherine went home. She had a dinner that evening, something private, family, not photographed. The kind of evening that doesn't exist in the public record but that makes up the actual texture of a life. She would have been tired. The week had been full, and full weeks accumulate in the body in ways that don't always show on the surface. But there was, according to people who knew her in these years, a quality to her tiredness that was different from the tiredness of her earlier royal life. It was the tiredness of someone who had given real energy to real work and felt, in the marrow of the evening, that the energy had been well spent. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. Because the question that the week had raised, quietly under all the noise of yellow dresses and Sussex travel itineraries and comparative tabloid photography, was the question that the British monarchy itself was quietly answering in real time. What is this for? Not the institution in the abstract, not the historical argument about constitutional monarchy and symbolic national continuity, which is a legitimate argument that people make in good faith. But, in the specific, practical, human sense, what is the point of a royal family? What does it do that justifies its existence in a modern democracy? What does it give to the people who fund it through their taxes and watch it through their cameras and form opinions about it over their morning coffee? Catherine's answer, performed through 3 days of yellow and presents and a child running across a school hall, was this: it gives you someone who actually shows up, not someone who performs showing up. Not someone who shows up when the cameras are arranged and the cause has been selected for maximum resonance and the photographs have been planned. Someone who has made showing up the organizing principle of their public life. Someone for whom the small child's drawing is worth carrying carefully for the rest of the afternoon. Someone who has decided, deliberately and at some personal cost, that the unglamorous work of being present in people's lives is the most important work available to them. That was the answer Catherine had spent 15 years arriving at. And now she was living in it. The Sussex trip would end. The photographs would cycle through the news. The comparison pieces would be written and read and argued about. And all of it would eventually recede into the archive of royal coverage, filed under the year and the month and the specific political weather that had made it feel urgent. But something about Catherine in the yellow dress, the specific, accumulated, undeniable quality of it, felt like it was going to last longer than the news cycle. It felt like evidence. Evidence of something that was happening slowly, deliberately, in the background of all the noise, a woman growing fully into the most demanding role in Britain, at precisely the moment when the world needed to be reminded why the role existed. The week wasn't over. There was one more day. And the last day would be the one that people would remember. Friday arrived with the kind of British morning that can't make up its mind, grey overhead, a thin gold light threatening to break through from the east, the air carrying that particular smell of impending rain that people who grew up on that island recognize before they're fully awake. Catherine was already up. She had a final engagement that week, and it was a smaller one, not the headline event, not the kind of appearance that gets flagged in advance in the royal calendar as a major occasion. A visit to a hospice on the outskirts of the city, one of those places that does the quietest and most necessary work of all, where staff and volunteers and family members move through long corridors in a kind of sustained, ongoing act of love that the world mostly doesn't talk about because it doesn't know how. These were not the places that generated good photographs. They were not the places where someone building an image would choose to go, because the dignity of the people inside them required a camera discipline that made the whole enterprise unsuitable for the kind of royal coverage that moved social media. Catherine went anyway. She had been going to places like this for years. Quietly, with small teams, with a press presence so scaled back it was almost theoretical. She went because she believed, because she had spent 15 years building a belief, grounded in actual research and actual listening and actual time spent in rooms like this one, that the presence of someone who cared, genuinely and without agenda, was itself a form of care. That people who were in the hardest chapters of their lives deserved to feel seen by someone whose visibility, whose very presence, carried a kind of cultural weight. Not as a celebrity visit. Not as a photo opportunity. But as a human gesture from a woman who happened to also be the Princess of Wales. She stayed longer than the schedule required. She always stayed longer than the schedule required. By mid-morning, the Sussex story had reached its final chapter. The trip was over. The photographs had been released in their final batch, a closing sequence of images carefully designed to leave a particular impression, a last frame in the narrative being constructed about two people who wanted the world to understand that they were doing important things in important places with important people. The final press release was precise and purposeful. The language about impact and legacy and the ongoing work of their foundation was fluent and sincere-sounding. Everything was properly assembled. And yet, there is a word that kept surfacing in the commentary that week, across different publications and different platforms and different corners of the cultural conversation, and the word was authentic. People were asking, in various registers and with various levels of analytical sophistication, which version of royalty they were looking at was the authentic one. Which story was real? Which presence, the one in Britain, in yellow, in the community center and the school and now the hospice, or the one abroad, in the curated locations, doing the managed tour, which one reflected something genuine about the people at its center? It's a complicated question when you ask it about people. Almost no one is purely authentic or purely performing. Almost everyone, given a camera and an audience, adjusts something, the posture, the expression, the word choice, the emphasis. This is human. This is not hypocrisy. It is simply the thing that happens when private people become public figures, which is that a gap opens between the self who exists in private and the self who is presented to the world, and you spend the rest of your public life managing that gap, trying to keep it from widening into something that feels dishonest even to yourself. Catherine had that gap. Everyone did. But what made her remarkable, in this week and in these years, was how narrow the gap had become. The woman the cameras caught in the school hall, laughing genuinely at the child's explanation of his drawing, that laugh was real. You can tell. Not because royal watchers are experts in detecting genuine laughter, though some of them have logged enough hours to develop a genuine competence in this area. But because the situation was not one that required a performance of delight. The child was not important. The drawing was not important. There was nothing strategically useful about finding that particular exchange funny. She laughed because it was funny. Because the child was funny. Because being in that room, doing that work, produced in her a kind of joy that didn't need to be manufactured. That is what authenticity looks like, in practice. It looks like laughing at the right moments for no strategic reason. The hospice visit ended. Catherine came out into the thin gold light of a British Friday afternoon, and someone in the small crowd outside said something that made her stop and turn, and she talked to them for a few minutes, properly talked, with the kind of eye contact that tells you the other person has put their schedule away in their head and is actually here, in this moment, with you. Then, she got in the car. Then, she was gone. The photographs from the hospice visit were released later that day. Not many of them. The ones that existed were careful, taken by a pool photographer with instructions to respect the dignity of the place. But they were enough to show what had happened there. Catherine's face in those photographs was different from her face in the yellow dress photographs. Still recognizable, still that same quality of warmth and presence and the high-wattage smile that she deployed so well, but quieter. More interior. The face of someone who had been in a room where the stakes were real and had given herself to it completely. The world noticed. It always noticed when she gave herself to something completely. The Sussex trip had already fallen from the top of the news cycle by Friday evening. That was the nature of the modern news metabolism. Things that feel enormous on Monday are archived by the following weekend, pushed down the feed by the next thing and the thing after that. The photographs would persist in the record. The commentary would be cited in future articles when the Sussex narrative next required context. But the immediate urgency of it, the sense that this was the conversation happening right now, that was fading. Catherine's week was not fading. There was something cumulative about it that resisted the normal arc of the news cycle. Each day had added to the previous one, building something that functioned less like a collection of individual stories and more like a single, sustained argument. The argument was this: here is what it looks like when someone has done the work, not the visible work, the meetings and the engagements and the photographs, but the interior work. The work of understanding what you're for. The work of building a belief system that is sturdy enough to survive scrutiny and personal difficulty and the merciless attention of a world that never quite decided whether it admired you or resented you or both simultaneously. Catherine had done that work. She had done it over 15 years, beginning in the fishbowl years of being the most photographed young woman on the planet and navigating that experience without the benefit of having watched anyone else navigate it first. She had done it through pregnancies and public engagements and the complicated machinery of learning to be royal without losing herself inside the institution. She had done it through the fracture in her family, the departure of the brother-in-law she had been close to, the positioning and repositioning and the occasional direct fire that came with that departure, the necessity of being dignified in circumstances where dignity required real effort. She had done it through illness, and through recovery, and through the very public process of returning to a role that had not stopped requiring things of her while she was away healing. All of that was behind her now. Not gone, nothing of that weight simply goes, but behind her. Metabolized into something that showed in her face and her body language and the quality of her presence in rooms. She wore it the way very good actors wear a character, completely, with no visible seam between the person and the role. The fashion press, which had its own language for these things, would spend the following weeks analyzing the yellow dress in terms of its cut and its color and its place in the evolution of Catherine's public style. They would trace the thread from her early, more conservative choices through to this moment, charting the graph of increasing confidence, the way a woman's wardrobe tells the story of her relationship with her own visibility. They would make arguments about the symbolism of yellow, its associations with optimism and energy and the particular brightness of something that refuses to be overlooked, and some of those arguments would be reaching, as fashion analysis often is, but some of them would be, quietly, correct. Because color is not nothing. What we choose to put on our bodies in front of witnesses is not nothing. Catherine had chosen yellow at a moment when the world was watching her closely, when there was a parallel narrative being constructed elsewhere that was competing for the same attention, when the question of what royalty was and who it belonged to and what it meant in the modern world was actively, openly in play. She had chosen the color that meant I am here, I am present, I am not going to make you look for me. It was not an accident. But here is the thing about Catherine, and this is the thing that separated her, finally, and completely, from the version of royalty that operated primarily as image management. The dress was only the beginning of what she showed you. The dress got you to look. What kept you looking was everything underneath it. The belief. The consistency. The 15 years of showing up to the hospice and the school and the community center and the meeting with the early years researchers and the conversation with the expert on childhood development at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning when nobody was photographing it and nobody would ever know it happened. The accumulation of all that unseen work, like the invisible mass of an iceberg, giving weight and stability to the 10% of her that the world could see. That was what made the yellow dress a statement. Not the color. Not the cut. Not the designer or the earrings or the way the fabric caught the afternoon light. But the woman inside it, who had earned the right to stand in a room and be seen, because she had spent years doing the work in rooms where nobody was watching. The Sussex trip faded. The photographs filed themselves away in the archive. the commentary moved on to the next thing, because the commentary always moved on to the next thing. But something about Catherine's week, the quality of it, the fullness of it, the way it had felt less like a sequence of engagements and more like a completed sentence, lingered in the cultural memory longer than news cycles usually allowed. People kept coming back to the photographs. Not to analyze them, not to argue about them, but just to look at them. At the woman in yellow, crouching on the floor, her whole body saying "I am listening," at the woman in the hospice, her face quieter, carrying the weight of a room that asked a great deal. At the woman outside, in the thin gold light, talking to a stranger as though the stranger's words were the most important thing happening in the world at that precise moment. There was something in those images that answered a question people hadn't quite known they were asking. The question was not about royalty, exactly. It was about something more fundamental. About what it means to build a life out of service to something larger than yourself, and to do it not because you had no other choice but because you looked at the available options and chose this one, deliberately, with open eyes, knowing what it would cost. About what it looks like, in the face and the body and the way a person moves through a room, when the choosing has been right. Catherine, Princess of Wales, in the yellow dress, in the school and the community center and the hospice on a quiet Friday morning, was that answer. She wasn't perfect. She had never claimed to be. She was a woman who had grown up in public, made her mistakes in public, struggled in public, healed in public, and had arrived through the long, unglamorous, essential process of becoming who she was always going to be at this exact moment. Fully present. Fully herself. Standing in the light with her shoulders back and the color blooming around her like a held breath finally released. And the world, which had been watching her for 15 years with every complicated feeling it had, looked at her and felt something it hadn't felt in a while. It felt certain. Not about the monarchy, not about the ongoing drama of the Windsor family and its fractures and its futures, not about any of the large structural questions that had no clean answers. But about something smaller and more durable than all of that. About this one woman, in this one week, having done something real. And that was enough. That was, in the end, everything.